This is the Gospel according to St. John in the 15th chapter, verses 12 and 13. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. As Melissa Johnson said to me this morning, there are no coincidences. I found it very interesting that on the back of their card, it lists the scripture that you chose for your mission, correct? And I decided to preach not according to the lectionary, but I had something specific I wanted to preach about, and this text was one of the two texts that I wished to use. So I find that quite significant. And before we begin with the proclamation, I want to once again thank the choir. I started in my mind to say for what you add to worship, but that's insufficient. For your part in you make a proclamation through your music, just like Richard or I attempt to with words. And it's so important to our worship here, and thank you. As always, I appreciate Dr. Doug agreeing to be liturgist. You heard what I asked the children, although I used the word brave. So what does it mean to have courage? How do faith and love relate to courage? And how does this relate to the living of our lives today? Courage is probably one of the most familiar virtues. From cowboys to superheroes, models of courage abound in our films and our stories. In our culture, courage is perhaps better known as an American value than a Christian virtue, since it epitomizes qualities that Americans idolize: strength in adversity, tough self-reliance. Despite its apparent familiarity, however, courage has a side most of us have not thought about much. The side of courage that is revealed in the endurance of great suffering. This courage shows its real character when our vulnerability is greatest and our strength is exhausted. Then, as St. Paul puts it, God's power is made perfect in our weakness. In America, we value independence, being able to care for ourselves. As a result, we treat weakness, vulnerability, and suffering as evils to be avoided, prevented, and overcome. We live in a cultural climate which fails to perceive any value or meaning in suffering, but rather considers suffering the epitome of evil to be eliminated at all costs. A Christian view of courage knows that suffering, for all its horror, is not the greatest evil. It is worse to do evil than to suffer it. Christian courage also knows that it need not fear weakness, for it knows that suffering can be a crucible of self-transformation, an opportunity for a new vision. Like Job, it is precisely when we are bent low from desperate weakness and pain that we are most likely to learn to say, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." This way of thinking about suffering has its source in a radically different understanding of strength and power. What is the source of this understanding? As Christians, we have a different ideal of goodness because we have a different role model in mind. Becoming virtuous amounts to becoming more and more like Christ. Being created anew by the Spirit means emulating Christ's character, His wisdom, His gentleness, His truthfulness. To understand each of the virtues, then, we should look first to what the person and life of Christ revealed to us to understand the virtue of courage. We need to ask, what does Christ teach us about true strength? He teaches us that love can lead us to endure suffering and pain and even death on a cross. If we want a model of courage, look at Christ's life of suffering love. This model of courage is a startling contrast with the typical American picture of courage. Perhaps it is a model of courage and strength of which only a Christian can make sense. St. Augustine defines courage as love readily bearing all things for the sake of the object beloved. For courage to point beyond itself, for love to bear all things, we must have something we love more than the suffering and pain that we fear. Love is the essence of courage. The most courageous soldier in combat fights not because what is in front of him, but because he loves who is behind him. A young Army officer who was awarded this nation's highest award for courage, the Medal of Honor, for his actions in Vietnam, when he single-handedly charged a large enemy force across open terrain, was asked how he could find such courage. And he replied, "I loved my men. I couldn't let them hurt my boys anymore." He displayed amazing courage, selfless courage, because he had great love for others. St. Aquinas called courage an enabling virtue which serves as an indispensable aid when good is threatened. If there were no obstacles to truth and goodness in this world, there would be no need for courage. Courageous suffering is not merely enduring pointless pain in a meaningless world. The suffering the Christian is called to bear is most often the result of trying to love others in a broken world. Great love almost always involves suffering, whether it's in small doses or dramatic losses. Courage is of no value without something good worth suffering for. When he set his face toward Jerusalem, Christ's mission was to suffer for our sakes, for the sake of love and its redeeming power to overcome suffering and death. Looking to Christ's example teaches us that courage is first of all an inner quality, a spiritual strength. It does not therefore require physical power or military might or the ability to overcome another person with force. This concept of courage puts the strength of a loving heart ahead of the strength of the sword. It contrasts with the classic American hero who, through his own strength and cunning, manages to overcome the bad guys and save the day all by himself. What do we do, though, when our own strength isn't enough? What if we find our personal strength wanting? Courage in life is necessary precisely because we are weak and vulnerable to harm. because pain and suffering are a very part of this human life we live. Courage cannot eliminate every threat and cannot gain for us guarantees of comfort and safety. Courage can, however, ensure that pain and suffering don't stop us from doing good. Especially in his moments of greatest vulnerability, Christ showed us the source of true strength, which is the love of God. The power of God's love far exceeds the limits of any human power, yet it can become our own. What Christ ensures for us in his dying on the cross and rising from the dead is that God will provide sufficient grace for our journey through this life, and that in the end, all tears will be wiped away. As the Apostle Paul reminds us, it is when we are wounded and helpless that we see most clearly that courage is not about trusting our own strength. Only God has the ultimate power. Only God has defeated death. When our own strength is exhausted by suffering, we see most clearly that strength is rooted in God's power and true courage inspired by his love. God promises you and me, as he promised Joshua long ago, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord God is with you wherever you go. The promise to which we hold fast is God's promise to help us stand firm against fear and to stand with us when we are powerless, so that love, not fear, has the last word in our lives. And now, although this is somewhat unusual in a sermon, to illustrate a point about God's love, God's power, and courage that comes from our recognition of God's love for us and his ultimate power, and in recognition of veterans, having just served Veterans Day, and in anticipation of our supper in a few days, I wish to read to you a Medal of Honor citation to illustrate the points I have made in this sermon. To me, as a military combat infantryman veteran from the Vietnam War, this particular Medal of Honor citation stands out from almost any other with which I'm familiar because of the breadth of courage that this particular individual displayed, to me, far exceeds even most other Medal of Honor citations that I have read. This is a citation issued to and presented by President Truman at the end of World War II to a young man from Lynchburg, Virginia named Desmond Doss. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, and he was a conscientious objector, but wanted to serve his country. So he became a combat medic assigned to an Army infantry division in the South Pacific. The actions for which he is cited are near the end of World War II. They are on Okinawa, and they cover not just one action, but actually several in one citation. In my judgment, as a combat infantry veteran, just the first part of this citation more than justifies the Medal of Honor. And the citation's not especially well written, as some of them were not in World War II. But just very briefly, I want you to understand the depth of courage. So I will try to set the scene for you just very briefly. This is on the island of Okinawa. There was extreme resistance by the Japanese. This infantry unit had climbed up a 400-foot tall escarpment, not a pure cliff, but close to it. And once on top of the escarpment, they had come under heavy attack by artillery, machine gun fire, etc. 75 men lay wounded. Everyone else escaped by going back down the escarpment, except for Desmond Doss, who wanted to stay with his men and care for them. For 5 hours alone, unarmed, under fire, he cared for these 75 men, drugged them one by one under fire to the lip of the escarpment, and lowered them down by a rope. Took the rope back and went again. He was a company aide man when the 1st Battalion assaulted a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. As our troops gained the summit, a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties and driving the others back. PFC Doss refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the many stricken, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment and there lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of the cliff to friendly hands. On May 2nd, he exposed himself to heavy rifle and mortar fire in rescuing a wounded man 200 yards forward of the lines on the same escarpment. And 2 days later, he treated 4 men who had been cut down while assaulting a strongly defended cave. He advanced through a shower of grenades to within 8 yards of enemy forces in a cave's mouth, where he dressed his comrades' wounds before making 4 separate trips under fire to evacuate them to safety. On the 5th of May, he unhesitatingly braved enemy shelling and small arms fire to assist an artillery officer. He applied bandages, moved his patient to a spot that offered protection from small arms fire, and while artillery and mortar shells fell close by, administered plasma. Later that same day, when an American was severely wounded by fire from a cave, he crawled to him where he had fallen 25 feet from the enemy position, rendered aid, and carried him 100 yards to safety while continually exposed to enemy fire. On the 21st of May, in a night attack on high ground, he remained in exposed territory while the rest of the company took cover, fearlessly risking the chance that he would be mistaken for an enemy soldier and giving aid to the injured until he was himself seriously wounded in the legs by a grenade. Rather than call another aid man from cover, he cared for his own injuries and waited 5 hours before litter bearers reached him and started carrying him to cover. The trio was caught in an enemy tank attack, and PFC Doss, seeing a more critically wounded man nearby, crawled off the litter and directed the bearers to give their attention to the other man. Awaiting the litter bearer's return, he was again struck, this time suffering a compound fracture of his arm. With magnificent fortitude, he bound a rifle stock to his shattered arm as a splint, and then crawled 300 yards over rough terrain to the aid station. Through his outstanding bravery and unflinching determination in the face of desperately dangerous conditions, PFC Doss saved the lives of many soldiers. His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry far and above the call to duty. When you read that or hear it, you must consider the man. That is the point of my reading this to you. A man who was so true to his Christian faith that in his case he could only serve as a conscientious objector, was totally unarmed throughout the war, gave credit to God for everything he was able to achieve on those days, those actions that I read to you. And at the time they were preparing this book for Medal of Honor winners, they wanted to take his photograph, which is here, very humble man, very quiet, and you probably can't see the picture, but he's praying because he told the photographer, yes, you can take my photograph, but first I want to pray. And that's when the photographer took his photo. We can't all be Desmond Doss. He was a man who was placed in extraordinary circumstances, and by his telling, God placed him there to save those who he saved. We can't all be like that, being brave. We can't always be brave like Charles and Melissa Johnson, giving up their lives here and going to serve others in Africa. But each of us, motivated by our faith in God and God's love for us, can find a way to do good in this world in God's name. So let each of us try to find what that calling is for us and show God our love for Him. Amen.